All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep into a story that honestly feels like something straight out of one of those, like, political thriller movies.
Yeah.
We get this whole situation with, like, a former prime minister who's ended up behind bars, and there's all these accusations of corruption flying around, right?
Right.
And then, just to make things even more interesting, we've got this figure who's coming straight out of the Trump administration, and he's basically stepping onto the world stage. And get this, he's actually advocating for this guy's release. It's wild.
Yeah.
We're talking about Imran Khan and Richard Grenell, and honestly, their paths are crossing in a way that, I gotta say, it could have some pretty serious implications for how the U.S. and Pakistan relate to each other on the world stage.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation worth paying attention to.
So, you and I, we've been following Khan's whole journey, like from way back when he was crushing it on the cricket pitch to when he transitioned into this whole political arena, right?
Yeah.
And, his whole vision for this, like, Naya Pakistan, it really seemed to resonate with people. But now here we are, and he's facing all these charges, he's been imprisoned, and it's like, how do we even begin to make sense of this, especially considering all the promises and the hope that he initially brought to the table?
Well, I think it's fair to say that this is a pretty dramatic fall from grace for Khan. And to be honest, it kind of highlights just how unpredictable Pakistani politics can be.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to remember, we're talking about a country that has a long and complicated history with things like military coups and institutions that, when it comes to democracy, are, let's just say, they're still finding their footing.
Yeah.
And Khan, well, with his whole anti-establishment message and his attempts to kind of, push back against the influence of the military, well, let's just say he probably made some pretty powerful enemies along the way.
Makes sense.
So these corruption charges, whether they're legit or, maybe politically motivated, well, they kind of serve as a handy tool to, let's say, move him out of the picture for a while.
Okay, so we've got this already kind of tense situation brewing, and then Richard Grenell steps in, right?
Right.
And he's not exactly being quiet about it. He's out there publicly demanding that Khan be released, and he's even going so far as to call the charges against Khan false, implying that it's all just a big political game. And get this, he's even making comparisons between Khan's situation and all the legal battles that Trump's been going through. It's kind of bold.
Yeah.
So, given what we know about Grenell, his background, and how he's never really been one to shy away from speaking his mind, what do you think is driving him to take such a strong stance in all of this? Like, what's his angle?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, Grenell, he's a smart guy, politically savvy.
Yeah.
He definitely knows that by aligning himself with Khan, he's going to grab some headlines and, there's a good chance he might even gain some favor with Trump's base. So there's definitely a strategic element to all of this, for sure. But, it's also possible that he truly believes that Khan is being unfairly targeted, a victim of political maneuvering. After all, he's been pretty vocal about his criticisms of the Pakistani government before, so it's not totally out of character.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so all of this brings us to what I think is a pretty crucial point in the whole relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan.
Right.
Like, if we think back to how things shifted after 9/11, especially how the U.S. was relying so heavily on Pakistan to help with counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan, well, it created this kind of complicated situation.
Yeah, for sure.
Like this mix of dependence and mistrust, this kind of delicate dance they had to do with each other. So how do you think all that history, how does it play into what Grenell's doing now?
Well, that's a really important part of the story here. I mean, the U.S., they still need Pakistan's help in the region. That hasn't changed.
Right.
But at the same time, there's still this wariness about Pakistan's connection with the Taliban and just the general political instability within the country. So Grenell, he's kind of stepping into this minefield. And honestly, his actions could end up having some consequences that no one saw coming.
Yeah.
If he ends up emboldening Khan's supporters, well, that could make Pakistan even more unstable, and that would make them an even less reliable partner for the U.S., which is the opposite of what they want, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, maybe he's trying to use his support for Khan as a way to pressure the Pakistani government to get them to make some concessions,
It's like a high-stakes poker game.
It really is.
And, it's
Right.
interesting that you mentioned Khan supporters because they're a pretty big part of this whole equation.
Oh, it's
Right?
totally.
I mean, there have been huge protests demanding his release, and that just adds another layer of complexity to everything.
For sure. Khan's still got a lot of people backing him, especially among younger folks who saw him as a symbol of hope and change. So his imprisonment, it's really energized his base. And it's fueled this anti-government sentiment that was already kind of simmering beneath the surface.
Right.
And now, with Grenell basically giving them a voice on the world stage, it's going to be fascinating to see how the Pakistani government reacts to all of this.
Yeah.
Like, are they going to come down hard on the protests, which could just make things even more unstable? Or are they going to try to find a way to appease Khan's supporters, which could potentially weaken their own position? It's a tough spot to be in.
It really makes you think about how actions taken in Washington, even if they seem like they're mostly focused on domestic politics, can have these ripple effects that reach way beyond U.S. borders, you know?
Totally.
And I think it's particularly interesting to consider the Pakistani diaspora in the U.S. and how much influence they have. Do you think Grenell's aware of this dynamic? Like, is he maybe trying to use it to his advantage?
Oh, I think he's definitely aware of it. The Pakistani-American community, they're a powerful voting bloc, and Grenell's not going to overlook that. He knows that by tapping into their concerns about Khan, it could benefit him and the Trump administration, at least politically. And I think it's a good reminder that domestic and foreign policy, they're not as separate as we sometimes think, especially in today's world where everyone and everything's so interconnected.
That's a good point. It also kind of speaks to this bigger trend we've been seeing globally, right? This rise of populism and the way it's challenging democratic norms in so many different places.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we've seen it with Trump here in the U.S., with Bolsonaro down in Brazil, and now with Khan in Pakistan. Do you see any common threads running through all these movements?
Definitely. I mean, a lot of these leaders, they tap into this feeling that people have, this sense of being disillusioned with the establishment. They promise to shake things up, to disrupt the status quo, you know.
Yeah.
And they tend to be pretty charismatic figures, and they're really good at using social media to connect with their supporters directly. They kind of bypass those traditional media outlets altogether.
Yep.
And they often present themselves as these victims, like the system's rigged against them, even as they're, kind of chipping away at democratic institutions from the inside.
It's kind of like they're playing the game while also rewriting the rules as they go.
Yeah, exactly.
And Grenell using Twitter to voice his support for Khan, that's a perfect example of how social media can just amplify political messages and shape the narratives that people are hearing all around the world.
It is. I mean, Grenell's tweets, they're reaching millions of people, and that has the potential to shift public opinion and even put pressure on governments. It's like this new form of diplomacy, or maybe it's undiplomacy, I don't know, but it's something we're still figuring out how to deal with.
So after all of that, what's the takeaway for our listeners? I mean, we've covered Khan's rise and fall. We've talked about the U.S. Pakistan relationship and all its complexities. And we've even touched on the roles that global populism and social media are playing in all of this. What's the one thing you hope people walk away with?
Honestly, I just think it's a good reminder that the world's a pretty complicated place. What happens in one corner of the world can have ripple effects that reach far beyond. And those lines between what's local and what's global, well, they're getting blurrier all the time.
And as you go about your day, the question I want you to think about is this. Will Grenell's vocal support for Imran Khan be the catalyst that sparks some major change in U.S. foreign policy? Or will it just end up being a small footnote in a much bigger story that's still unfolding? Only time will tell, right?
That's the truth.
So keep your eyes open and keep those minds engaged. This is a story that's far from over.
Definitely not.
We'll be back soon to dive into another fascinating topic. Until then, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.